Thanks, friend. So warm. I appreciate that. Good evening, everyone. My name is Adriana. Excited to be here with you tonight. I want to tell you a little bit about our work at the Kensington Corridor Trust in Philadelphia. And then I really want to center our discussion and conversation today around democratic participation in governance and power building and power shifting, moving policy, using that power. My hope is that we'll spend somewhere in the ballpark to like 20 to 30 minutes where I will present. And then I want to flip and turn to questions that folks may have about any aspect of our work. Before we jump in, I do just want to name that the Kensington Corridor Trust is the nation's first neighborhood trust. We are not a community land trust. We think of community land trusts and that model as like a sister cousin to our work, very similar goals, vastly different legal infrastructures and protections. And so I'll try to touch on some of that during the presentation, but also happy if it's a question that arises for folks to unpack it further during the Q&A. I would also encourage folks to write your questions down as I'm presenting or put them into the chat so that when we move into the Q&A period, it'll be pretty easy to tackle some of the questions. And I don't want folks to lose their thoughts along the way as well. So write them down, put them in the chat. All right, so the trust, why do we exist? The trust was formed back in 2019, very intentionally with the purpose of reducing vacancy on Kensington Avenue, which is one of the primary commercial corridors in the neighborhood, so that the neighborhood could directly control and govern over those assets. So we are an anti-displacement model, so working very intentionally to ensure that the folks who have lived in Kensington historically or have had their small businesses in Kensington historically can continue to access affordable spaces into the future as external pressures of gentrification and speculation impact the market and impact the cost of real estate and doing business in this neighborhood. As I noted, we're the first in the country to build the neighborhood trust model. The model has since been replicated numerous times across the country, and we are partnering early stage partnership to support some folks in replicating the model as well. Our work at its core and like simplest terms is we purchase real estate on the avenue, primarily commercial mixed use, but we also take in vacant lots and we put them in the trust for the neighborhood to directly own, govern, and control the real estate. It is working to ensure intergenerational affordability alongside collective control of real estate. We see our points of impact across these three areas, so power, justice, and ownership. From a power perspective, it's acknowledging that historically the folks who have amassed power did so through wealth building, which oftentimes is tied to land ownership. So what we kind of like to say about that aspect of history is that those who were able to amass the land, amassed the wealth, amassed power. And that's not to say that that's the only way to gain or access or grow power, but it is a very clear pathway. It's also a clear pathway to wealth building, whether you think about it from the perspective of a first-time homebuyer who owns their home and they're building intergenerational wealth through that, or you're thinking about small-scale developers who are acquiring assets and growing their portfolio. There are lots of different ways in which folks use land and buildings as a means to grow wealth and power. And so we figured, well, if folks can do it on their own, why can't we do it in the collective? Why can't we use real estate as a tool by which we can leverage collective power for the purpose of moving policy, for the purpose of moving dollars, for the purpose of controlling the outcome of a neighborhood that's actively experiencing displacement? Justice is at the center of all of our work, and justice for us is very broad. It's economic, it's racial, it's social, and it is both tangible and intangible. It is the direct impacts of systems and systemic barriers that have been intentionally placed against low income and Black and brown communities and neighborhoods like Kensington. So it is in the overt as well as in the less seen. Our work, particularly as it comes to policy, does tend to have a focus on land justice and sovereignty, as well as environmental justice, and we'll have a conversation about those. But at the core of all of our work is really economic justice, which is rooted in racial justice. So really acknowledging, again, in a predominantly Black and brown neighborhood, And for context, Kensington is about 60% Hispanic and Latine, about 20% Black, and about 20% white. So 80% of the folks in our neighborhood are identifying as Black or brown folks. And the average household median income for our neighborhood is $25,000 per year. And that's across our 6 census tracts. Just to compare that to the city of Philadelphia, which many of you may know is America's largest poorest city, the average household median income in the city of Philadelphia, 1.6 million residents, is just over $55,000 per year. So the whole city, average household median income, about $55,000 per year. Then you go to this neighborhood in Philadelphia called Kensington, and the average household median income is not even half of the city's average household median income, right? And that's in a city that's already, under kind of cutting, if you would, in terms of what the costs of living are and their direct correlations with low income. The other thing worth noting specifically about Philadelphia, because we are seated inside of the state of Pennsylvania, the minimum wage in Pennsylvania is still $7.25 per hour. So it follows the federal minimum wage, which has not been reset in about 20 years. The last area of impact for us, as we see it, is around ownership, right? Kind of back to where I started around power. Those who control the land control the future, and land is a finite resource, right? There's not any more land coming. We could argue about that all day in terms of like, what will mankind do to potentially produce more land on this planet? But by design, in terms of the way that the Earth sits currently, there's not any additional land. So what exists is what exists. And if anything, we're losing land when we think about climate change and rising tides and rising water. So for us, ownership is really rooted in how we can apply this work across these different modalities. Again, not just ownership, but also policy advocacy, not just policy advocacy, but also upward mobility, economic upward mobility for residents and small business owners. It's about access. It's about opportunity. All of that is deeply rooted for us in a legacy where we did not have access to ownership. And so we want to create a new legacy and define a new future in which ownership is possible. This is our policy platform. We advocate across 4 core policy priority areas. The first, which shouldn't be a surprise, is affordability. We focus here primarily on affordability for homeowners and residential tenants, but also with a focus on commercial spaces as well. The areas of policy that we've been focused on in this space currently are around the definition of affordability. I don't want to get into like a super deep policy explainer, but affordability is very poorly defined in this country. It uses an archaic metric set by HUD around the federal poverty line, which has not been properly adjusted for decades. And so when we think about affordability, we're oftentimes leaving lots of folks behind. And so we want to make sure that affordability is redefined and that policies and dollars are moved in the direction of true affordability for folks who are trying to make Philadelphia home or trying to make other parts of the country home. Also, hopefully not surprising, we're working on land sovereignty and justice. In this space, we spend a lot of time talking about land disposition with the city of Philadelphia, who controls thousands of parcels. And the majority of those parcels are released to folks who are providing market rate units, even when those lots are located in extremely low income census tracts like Kensington. And so what that does for the market, if it moves it, if it produces property tax increases, and while it may generate mixed income, oftentimes some of the unintended or unforeseen consequences cause harm to long-term residents who are trying to, particularly for seniors who are trying to age in place. We focus on neighborhood health and safety. This for us is kind of a catch-all bucket where we can really leverage vast forms of power or a myriad forms of power. It can be around education, it can be around health, it can be around food, transportation, public safety, you name it. We probably can determine a way to move in collaboration with folks across the city, and again, with an emphasis on the Kensington neighborhood, because everything impacts neighborhood health and safety. And then our last core area of advocacy is environmental justice. And in this space, we spend a lot of time thinking about what it looks like for the city of Philadelphia to invest in remediation and repair in neighborhoods that have experienced environmental harms like Kensington. So we're thinking about things like illegal dumping, tire fires. You may have heard sometime in the last 10 years, Kensington had one of the largest tire fires in the history of the United States, and it happened just like blocks off of Kensington Avenue. We recently had another massive fire in December that was also very close to Kensington Avenue. And so all of these things are impacting air quality, they're impacting particulate matter, and we are working very intentionally to ensure that the city of Philadelphia takes the appropriate measures to remediate when folks are experiencing harm as a result of some of these larger actions that are happening, whether they are intentional or accidental. And so this is what it looks like when it translates, when power translates from, just individual ownership, one landlord owning one building, to collective ownership in an entire neighborhood controlling and governing over its assets. It looks like being able to handpick the businesses that come to your corridor and not doing so in a way that is placated or in some way like false, where we don't want folks to simply vote for the sake of voting. They're voting in a legal matter, which is whether or not they want to see a business on their corridor. And so whenever there is a new business that's being attracted to Kensington Avenue, specifically to a space that's collectively owned and governed inside of the trust, we do about 2 to 3 months of engagement to try to connect with as many residents and small business owners as possible to make sure that they want to see these businesses on their corridor. And so I'm offering these as examples of some of the businesses that we've attracted. You'll see that there's a one-pager that's produced about each business where we just talk about what it is that they're doing and then some of the kind of key things that folks should know about that business. And we're attending tons of community meetings during that time, during that 2 to 3 month process. Our community organizer is leading, and we are asking the small business owner to come with us. It's also worth noting that very organically and kind of unplanned from our point of view, when KCT was formed, when the Kensington Corridor Trust was formed, was that 100% of the businesses that we've attracted to the corridor, so like everyone, for example, that you see right here, these folks either grew up in or had their small business in Kensington already, right? So these folks, they grew up here or they've made Kensington home, either as current residents or current small business owners that just weren't on Kensington Avenue. And so what has happened is this really beautiful kind of fabric that's being woven between neighbors, between small business partners and friends, where folks are recognizing the businesses that we're presenting, whether it's a brand new business like PB&J or Zerby Arts or Waxery, or whether it's a longtime standing business like Kensington Food Company or Fatu Hair. Folks are recognizing these people as their neighbors and as businesses that they want to support. And so it's been a very successful process for us to attract businesses to the corridor into the collectively owned spaces. But business selection also means that you have the power to say what you don't want on your corridor. And so the neighborhood did vote several years ago that the trust is not allowed, legally not allowed, to lease to any extractive or predatory businesses. So we can't lease to things like check cashers, pawn shops, cash for gold. Those are not allowed in collectively owned spaces inside of Kensington. So anything that's held inside of the trust can only be something that is culturally competent and value additive. And that decision and determination, again, is made by residents and small business owners. It's not made by staff. It's not even made solely by the people who govern directly at our board of directors level. It's made by the broader neighborhood, and then our board of directors takes that information to take the final vote. And so you probably have a sense for the fact that we end up having to do, as a result of the way that we want to do this work, a lot of engagement and design. And so these are just some random pics that I picked real quick from our socials. But you'll see we're always out supporting local vendors. We do annual seed distribution. We do learning exchanges with folks across the country. We're a translocal member with Boston Ujima Project. We are constantly at City Hall, constantly meeting with the mayor and with council, working to build our presence with state reps as well currently, to really make sure that the 4 core policy areas that we're advocating around, that they have a very clear visual of, like, when they think about that policy area, that they instantly think about the Kensington Corridor Trust and the residents and the small business owners who are leading our work. We also do arts and arts integration into our work. This is not just about preservation of buildings and the reactivation of a corridor, but this is also about preservation of culture and history and art and public spaces. And so We also tend to do a lot of art-related activities. We're currently co-designing with residents a mural that is being led by one of our tenants, which is a long-standing Kensington artist and Kensington resident. And then we're constantly creating feedback loops. We're constantly asking folks, like, what is it that you want? What do you want to see us do? Give us the direction, provide us with the guidance. And so my team and I, we really see our role as following the directive of the neighborhood. And worth noting, I don't think I said it explicitly, 100% of the people who govern at the trust live in or have a small business in the 19134 zip code, which is where we're collectively owned. And half of our team currently lives in the neighborhood. So we are really representative on the governance standpoint from a legal perspective, legally required that people live in the 19134. On the staff side, really prioritizing hiring local and folks who have the shared experiences of the people that we're engaging with for power building and decision making. It's also worth noting that our governance was built by design and intentionally over a year-long process where we engaged residents and small business owners to ask them what they wanted governance to look like. So when the trust was first started back in 2019, we were governed by 4 institutions that helped to form and found the trust. And we transitioned to neighborhood governance in 2020. We made the decision to, by 2021, the governance had been transitioned, but there was no formal design for it, right? So what are the legal mechanisms by which we want to hold ourselves accountable? What are the boundaries for this work? What are the containers and the guardrails? How are the people that are selected for governance, how are they selected? How do we find them? What are the archetypes of the people that we need to have on governance, right? When we think about traditional 501c3 nonprofits, you will, almost always, if you're thinking about, traditional governance, you have your CPA or your accountant, you have an attorney, you have someone who understands HR, you have someone who understands programming, you likely have someone who has expertise in your specific programmatic area, right? So if you're a youth serving organization, you have someone who has deep expertise in serving youth, whether it's foster youth specifically, or youth who are reentering, or Black and Brown youth, or after school engagement with youth, right? Like you're bringing in that set of expertise. What we decided through this process, and the neighborhood decided this through this process, is that they didn't want to define expertise areas because we can always hire for those things. What they really wanted to define was who was at the table representing the neighborhood and being reflective of who is living there and doing business there. And so this is a visual that comes out of a report that we published that's on our website. If you wanted to find the fuller report, you can go to our website and hop into the resource center. And in there we have tons of publications, but this one specifically was an engagement toolkit that we put together around how to design governance. And so as a part of this process, because art is critical to the way that we do our work and we visualize it with community and residents and small business owners, we determined that what we wanted to do was hire a graphic illustrator to capture each of the meetings so that as decision points were being made, it was an instant check in the room, right? Like, is this what was said? Is this what we're all hearing? Is this what it feels like? Is this what it looks like? Offering a tangible takeaway for folks right in real time. And it gave us the ability to iterate, to redefine, to change, and to move together in collective. There were a total of 5 working group meetings and then a final presentation back to the full neighborhood. And ultimately what was decided was that in order to govern, you have to live in the 19134. In order to govern from a small business perspective and from a leasing perspective, you can't run an extractive practice. We wanted to have community leaders represented at the governing table. So people who already naturally hold power, think about people like block captains or civic association presidents or local nonprofit executive directors, et cetera. But we wanted, again, those community leaders to meet the residency requirements. So we weren't saying like, oh, be whichever nonprofit ED, be a nonprofit ED who lives in the 19134 and is community. We also wanted to make sure that there were youth leaders represented between the ages of 16 and 21. And this was a critical aspect for the governing formation and creation and development, because if we're not building for the future, then we're just kind of running in circles and we could potentially be causing long-term lack of sustainability. And so there are 2 seats reserved on our governance for youth between the ages of 16 and 21, intentionally to build power within youth, but also to make sure that we are building the bench for leadership and succession, as this is an intergenerational strategy. And so you'll see kind of, if you move to the right a little bit, there is a selection crisis that we run every year. And it allows for anyone who lives in the neighborhood to nominate themselves or be nominated by someone else to serve on governance. So rather than doing what we call elbow tap governance, right? So like I know Nia and I call Nia and I say, hey Nia, I'm starting a nonprofit and like come be on my board. Instead, what we're doing is saying we're saying, hey, anybody and everybody who lives in or has a small business in the 19134, every January for 30 days, we're opening applications. There's no cost to apply. You can do it online. You can do it over the phone. We can give you a paper form. And we want you to come forward, right? If you're interested in governing, it's a 2-year seat. It's also a compensated seat. So we pay folks double the living wage per hour to govern, which for Pennsylvania and specifically for Philadelphia County is about $44 per hour. We want to make sure that folks know that we value their time and we value the expertise that they're bringing as residents and small business owners. And as I said earlier, the folks who helped to design the governance were very intentional in saying it doesn't matter if we end up with a lawyer on the board. It doesn't matter if we end up with a CPA on the board because we can hire that expertise. You can't hire lived experience. You can't hire the experience of the folks who have lived in this neighborhood and have continued to deal with the systemic challenges that this neighborhood is constantly facing. So this is our governance recruitment process. As I noted, it opens every January. We put it out on socials. We flyer and canvas. We make calls. We make that as many folks as possible find out that the structure is opening and how many seats are available in any given year. The example that I offered up here was actually from 2024. We had several seats open that year, but this year we actually only had 2 seats open. So it will vary based on the year, based on the staggered terms. This is just a look at some of the folks who make up our governance. You'll see lots of beautiful Black and brown faces because they make up the majority of our neighborhood. You'll also see Miss Darlene Burton, who is, I don't know if my mouse works on the screen, but here and here. She is represented on both governing bodies. We have 2 governing bodies, one for the C3, one for the trust. And she's the cross-body member that is attending both sets of meetings and making sure that the conversations that are happening in both of those spaces are consistent and congruent and that she's taking back information where needed, in addition to obviously myself attending both meetings as well. Just at a high level about Kensington, 627 assets on our corridor. It's 1.4 miles long. We have 4 train stations on our corridor. So we're one of a handful of corridors across the country that have an elevated train directly over the corridor for the entire span of the corridor. We are actively targeting 192 assets on the corridor. Currently inside of the trust, there are 30, and we have our 31st currently under agreement. We tend to acquire about 5 per year. Last year, we had a really great year, and we were able to secure 8 assets into the trust. This is a map of the stewarded properties. You can also always see this on our website live. We update it by 6 a.m. the next day after any time that we close on a property. So these are the 30 assets that we steward inside of the trust. As you can see, for most of them, there's either density or proximity where they're located. That's very intentional. We want to make sure that the built environment is changing and that there's a physical change that helps to improve both health and safety, but also beautification. It helps people to vision and to dream. The woman at the top right in front of Waxery was the first small business owner that we attracted to the corridor back in 2022. Brown woman, grew up in Kensington, and deeply reflective of not just the archetype of the folks who grew up there, but also just has like deep tenacity and grit and has been a really successful business on the corridor and has remained. It's also worth noting that every business we've attracted to the corridor so far, and again, acknowledging that we just started with business attraction in 2022, but all of them have stayed and have successfully renewed their leases and are paying their rents on time. And then here on the bottom right, you'll see an image. And if you kind of follow the arrow, it takes you to the green circled area over here. This is an 11-lot pollinator garden that we steward inside of the trust. This is directly on the commercial corridor. So think about some of the busiest corridors that you've kind of been on in your life. This garden is smack in the middle of that busy corridor, and by intention and by design. It is also the city of Philadelphia's largest neighbor planted pollinator garden. So it is actively attracting butterflies and bees. And we did 2 years ago also start producing veggies at this garden in raised beds at the request of neighbors. So this is our 4th year operating the garden in its full glory. The babies that you see standing there in front of the mural are the babies from the mural behind them. So like these are the kiddos who are there in that mural. And it was a collectively designed mural done with the same artist that we're currently co-designing a different mural with the neighborhood. and it's one of the largest murals. I think it's like the second largest mural in the neighborhood. Here's our current impact, just at a really high level. Wanted to make sure I didn't leave you with like wonderings about what we've done. So there's 30 assets in the trust. There are currently 9 businesses inside of KCT spaces. We have another 4 slated to move in this year so far. We currently have 39 units under development. That includes residential and commercial. And we currently lease 26 residential units. It's also worth noting that everything that comes into the trust is permanently affordable. For us, affordability currently means 25 to 50% of the average household median income, which in comparison to many of the other folks who are leasing in the area is considered deeply affordable. And that moves me towards the end of the presentation. Our ethos and the way that we move is really from a property by property perspective. Lots of folks like to talk about it from a block by block. We are really granular in thinking about what it means to move with intention and around density. And we are very intentionally moving towards a future where neighborhoods have direct control, not just of the real estate, but of the policy that's happening and impacting their neighborhoods. And with that, I will move to questions. And I believe I saw things happening in the chat. Oh, they were warnings. Okay, well, look at that. I made it, I think. What do we think, friends? Questions that people may have. Thanks, Nicole. Are there any questions that folks have about how we acquire real estate, about how we move policy, about how we govern, about how we attract capital, our staffing structure? Different from a CLT, absolutely. And if you give me 10 seconds, we actually have a resource for this that I can pull up. So let me do that because it'll make it easier to talk about it.
All right. All right. Well, before we take questions, first of all, can people hear me?
Yes.
Okay, well, let's just give some love for you in the chat, Adriana. Thank you so much for being here. In the chat, you can come on mute, you can send a reaction. We are so excited and glad that you were able to share so much information with our base. And we do have our first question in the chat, which is, could you say a little bit more about how it's different than what people think about as a CLT?
You got it. So this is also on our website inside of our resource center. And we developed this because this question came up quite often. I want to make sure that I'm really clear and transparent in saying that the neighborhood trust model is an evolution of the community land trust model. So it's not like we believe that we came out of thin air with really amazing ideas. It's that there were decades worth of learnings that we were able to pull what we believed were the best aspects of and combined and made it into the neighborhood trust. Another model that we are frequently referred to or compared against are business improvement districts, community development corporations, and private developers. And so what we've done, and as I said, you can pull this up on our website later, we've done a model comparison across 4 areas. So the main activity of the structure, its legal form, how it's engaged and involved with the community, if at all, funding structures and streams, the purpose of the work, the time frame for the work, and the asset types that those models can support or protect or work with. And so with business improvement districts, what we learned is that it's really helpful and beneficial when there's someone who is supporting the built environment. So thinking about greening and cleaning, thinking about lighting, thinking about what we would call crime prevention through environmental design strategies, or CEPTED strategies, which is a national framework. It's not something that KCT came up with, but that we've applied in our work. Business improvement districts do that work, and they do it well. The challenge with launching a business improvement district on Kensington Avenue is that the way that this model self-sustains itself is through fees and assessments. So essentially they're assessing fees against the small business owners who are on that corridor in order to be able to provide the services. And for a corridor that has very low vacancy and that has very active businesses that have a solid revenue stream and solid bottom line, right? So like they're in the green, it makes a ton of sense. For Kensington Avenue, which has very high vacancy and small businesses that were very actively and continue to in many ways struggling to survive and stay open and pay their expenses, et cetera, it didn't make sense to provide kind of an extra bill to folks in order to do some beautification work. So we said, okay, well, we really want to do the green, the clean, the CEPTED, but we don't want to do the fees. Then we looked at the community land trust structure. which has been preserving affordability for decades. There are over 400 community land trusts that exist in the United States. They were started in Black communities in Georgia to protect and preserve agriculture and farmlands. It was a very clear model from which we could learn about what it looks like to do long-term work and what it looks like to protect housing primarily. There are ways to protect commercial spaces. There are ways to protect land, just like vacant land inside of community land trusts. But its most common format is for protecting housing, both rental and home ownership. And what is done in the community land trust model is they are separating the land from the built improvement. So the land stays inside of the trust, and then they sell the house or the building that's on the land to low, moderate income, typically first-time home buyers. It is there with a deed restriction that when they sell, they have to sell to another low to moderate income home buyer, which is great because it preserves affordability. The challenge is that it is more difficult to grow intergenerational wealth inside of community land trust models for those individual families because they're locked out of the land, which is what's gaining a lot of the value over time. And they're locked out of significant appreciation because of the affordability covenants. So we knew we didn't want to engage in land leases. And our work was really about collectivizing ownership, not individual ownership. So things to learn, but it wasn't a model we wanted to replicate. We then looked at community development corporations, and they have been really effective at securing grant dollars and non-recoverable dollars and subsidy dollars and applying them towards the work. They're typically very neighborhood based. They tend to do a lot of local hiring. They are deeply rooted in community engagement and right relationship for the most part. But they are simply a 501c3, just as the community land trust is. And so what protects the assets is simply the bylaws. So for anybody who's familiar with bylaws, it's the legal instrument that codifies and kind of dictates or tells the nonprofit organization how it will be governed and how it can move and operate. And so those bylaws have voting covenants inside of them that allow for future people or even the current people, should they choose, to change those bylaws. Typically, it's by 2/3 majority. Sometimes it's by half or half plus one, right? So simple majority. But there's no permanent protection in either of them that can in any way legally protect from a future change to the bylaws. So we saw it as a risk to protecting real estate perpetually if there was just a kind of a simple or easy way to change those protections. And then we looked at private developers and we said, wow, these people are really good at amassing capital. So like we don't always and actually almost never align with the way that they're doing business. And they tend to be extractive and predatory, particularly in Kensington, in the way that they move and operate around speculation and asset development. But that being said, they are really, really good at amassing capital and they understand how to put together capital stacks rapidly and with the ability to generate revenue and surplus that allows folks to generate lots and lots of wealth. And so we wanted to figure out, well, how do we move like a private developer in terms of the capital markets such that we can both be competitive with them, but also make sure that those profits are staying in the neighborhood and that we're reducing extraction at as many points as possible. And so that's how the neighborhood trust was born, is by looking at these different models and saying, okay, here are the aspects that we really like. Here are the aspects that we're challenged by. Here are the things that this particular neighborhood needs. And here's how we will solve for that. And so our legal infrastructure, we are a 501c3 traditional nonprofit. We can take in grants and donations, but we are legally and financially tethered to something called a perpetual purpose trust. And I would encourage folks to visit our website later and again, dig into the resource center if you have additional questions. But at a high level, it is a trust structure. So something that allows you to protect real estate or liquid assets, so cash. You can also protect intellectual property inside of a trust as well. And it allows you to protect those things perpetually, hence the perpetual part of the purpose trust. And you are protecting those assets inside of the trust perpetually for a purpose. And that purpose is determined, identified, and codified, right? So like you put it to paper and you give it definition legally when the trust is being formed. And so when our trust was formed, we defined two core areas of purpose. The first is intergenerational affordability. for a neighborhood that's actively experiencing displacement. And the second was collective control and ownership of real estate in the commons. So outside of the speculative market, producing and providing long-term, permanently affordable housing and small businesses spaces for everyone to collectively own and collectively govern. And so those are some of the differences. I'm happy to unpack further if there's like an additional question that stems from any of that.
Thank you so
And
much. We're gonna go to the, oh, go for it. Were you gonna say something,
I was just gonna say,
Adriana?
Ray, do you want me to just keep going through the chat? But go ahead, moderate,
Yeah,
tell me, read to
I
me.
was gonna go ahead, yeah, go through the chat. So, yeah, so for the next thing, we're gonna ask there's a question from Iris. Could you speak a bit about interactions with local government and what ways can local elected support the formation of neighborhood trust? And in what ways can neighborhood trust elevate allied elected?
Great question. I will say I think this varies by neighborhood, by city, by state. In Kensington, when the trust was being formed, we had a different mayor, the 99th mayor of Philadelphia, Mayor Kenny, who did not prioritize Kensington and actually had containment strategies around how to maintain poverty and drug crime and sex trade inside of our census tracts so that it did not leak into or spill over to other parts of the city that were more affluent, white-centered, higher socioeconomics. So there was no alignment, actually, just like at all. And as a result of that, KCT's inception story and like our inception journey is one that is not dependent on government at all, which is another part of, I would say, one of our impact points, if you would, because most permanently affordable housing structures are deeply dependent on government subsidy, and we're not dependent on it at all. We've never received government subsidy to produce affordable housing. That being said, we now have the 100th mayor of Philadelphia, who is Philadelphia's first Black woman mayor. And Mayor Parker has been extremely focused on Kensington, doing constant community conversations, bringing our staff in to discuss what Kensington could, should look like based on what residents are asking for, based on what the city of Philadelphia needs Kensington to be. And it's been just a very different conversation, such that we were actually just formally invited to submit our first proposal to the city of Philadelphia for funding. So that is due for us next Tuesday, and we are running down a rabbit hole to make that happen. But we're very, very excited. We also have a new councilwoman. So our prior councilwoman was a longstanding politician, over 20 years in her seat. And I would say she supported us, but kind of just loosely and when beneficial or helpful, but not in practice, right? So she wasn't moving dollars or land to the trust. She didn't attend our events. We weren't really in right relationship. Our current councilwoman has been very intentionally supporting us with some of our challenges that we're facing, and right now is helping us to hopefully unlock 12 vacant lots from the city of Philadelphia's land bank. For folks who are not familiar, because I'm not sure if Boston has a land bank. Does Boston have a land bank?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So then you know what a land bank is. So the city of Philadelphia has one, and we're working to unlock 12 lots from that. So I say all that to say, I think it will be different in every neighborhood. I do think that having government support makes this work 10 times easier, right? There's no reason to make it harder. But you can do it without it also, like KCT has done without it since inception up until like right this second. So it is possible.
There's some in the chat.
So I never got this, y'all.
I was gonna say, friends, I can just self-navigate. It may be for the ease of time. There's like, only a couple minutes.
Yes, please.
So the
Thank
next
you.
question, oh, you're welcome, friends. The next question is about how we acquire property, what kind of capital it takes to start down this path, and how we raise that capital, which is a great question. So we blend subsidy and debt capital together, which many folks refer to as blended capital or integrated capital, in terms of like buzzwords that people use. It's just grant money that we don't have to repay, coupled with debt money that we do have to repay. And What that allows us to do is to blend down to affordability because we're mixing the non-recoverable dollars with the recoverable dollars. The debt specifically, we bring it in from foundation endowments. So we go to foundations and we say, hey, it's super cool. Well, that's facetious. It is interesting that you continue to place your money in the market, oftentimes which is continuing to compound harm on neighborhoods like Kensington and others. It'd be super cool if instead you place those dollars directly into projects like the Kensington Corridor Trust and put your dollars at play at the local level. You have the legal capacity to do that. It is just a choice. And so we educate philanthropy on a regular basis. That's a large part of what I do. I'm traveling across the country, talking to different folks about how they can move their endowment to be value aligned and to support local projects. So we ask foundations to lend to us from their endowment at below market terms. So if I went to the bank right now and I asked for a loan for a commercial mixed use property in Kensington, which is a high crime, high vacancy area, which they would consider under traditional capitalistic definition as risky or high risk, they would say, here's an 8% interest rate. If I take in an 8% interest rate, since I have no government subsidy, I wouldn't be able to preserve affordability. We would only be able to generate market rate or what we call market rate plus housing. Market rate plus for us is the market has said a one bedroom is 1,000. All of a sudden someone brings one along and they say, nope, now a one bedroom is 1,100, right? So they're not moving at market, they're moving at market rate plus. And then how do we raise this capital? As I said, we go across the country. I spend a lot of time on a lot of planes, asking a lot of people for a lot of money. It is exhausting, but extremely rewarding, and it allows us to move just as nimbly and as quickly as the private developers and speculators who are in our neighborhood. So we're not getting outbid as often. So 5 years ago, when the trust was started, we were getting outbid regularly. Now we're almost always like top bid and we're closing on that property. And because we do have a reserve of cash on hand at this point, we can do 15 and 30-day closes depending on the condition and the title for the company, for the asset rather, for the real estate, which makes us extremely competitive in the market. And so we're trying to just like, again, it's one of that learning that we had from private developers. Like, how do they do it? Oh, they build a reserve. How do they do that? They get on lots of planes. So I get on lots of planes and I do what needs to be done. Let's see, coming up with the trust.
Wait, Adriana, can you hear me?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I have a quick follow-up question.
Mm-hmm.
Only if you are able to do this, because you started to do it, but I wonder if you can, just to help us kind of concretely picture what you just talked about this a little more, could you try to provide an example with numbers? And you started to do that. So you started to say, if I went to a bank, it would be 8%. But could you kind of give us a sense of what the numbers look like in scenario A versus what Kensington Corridor Trust?
100%. Thank you, Nia, for making me finish a point. You're welcome. So we go to the bank. The bank goes, you can have a loan for 8% and you can have it for 5 years. That's your traditional commercial mixed use line. Commercial mixed use being there's residential and commercial in the same building. I go to the foundation. I provide some education. I do some arm bending and twisting. We all agree that providing a loan to the trust is a great idea and very value aligned. And what we do is we ask for them to give us a loan that's for 10 to 15 years at 2% or below. We want all of our debt, when possible, to be at 0% because we only believe in non-extractive forms of capital. I want to also just name that we believe that all loans are extractive because the reality is that most of that wealth was built on the back of brown and black folks across this country for all the various reasons that we all know. And we continue to know, right? Like, I love this phrase that is so true and I can't remember. Oh, profits are the unpaid wages of the working class, right? Like anytime you're generating millions and billions of dollars is because you underpaid the folks at the bottom of your structure. And so what does it look like to like reinvest that wealth in a different way? So just to do a quick comparison again, 8% interest rate with the bank, 2% interest rate with the foundation, 5-year loan with the bank, 10 to 15 years with the foundation. And I want to name that we do have debt that's at 0%. We have debt that's at 1%. We blend, our average blend is at 1%. So we take in some 2% debt, but blended with the 0 and the 1 that we get, we average about 1. To date, the trust is about 5.5 years old now. To date, we have never accepted debt beyond 2%. And that is very intentionally to make sure that we can preserve affordability. And that does make it harder to fundraise. And that does mean that we have to say no to money. But we are 10 toes down about what we're doing. And we firmly believe that that's the right type of capital to make this project sustainable and make the model replicable. Okay,
Thank
I'm
you,
going to move.
Adriana.
You're welcome. Next question. Thought process about coming up with the trust model. Great question. We looked at vacancy on the corridor. We looked at small businesses leaving the corridor. We looked at lack of affordability starting to emerge for folks who are renting in the neighborhood, like who live there. We started looking at displacement. And essentially, the founders of the KCT kind of took a look up into the world and into the nation, and they came across this model in theory. So the neighborhood trust model, in terms of like its name and like what it would ultimately do, was not designed by the founders of the trust. It was designed by a man named Joe Margulies, who's a tenured law professor at Cornell. And he was actually writing about Dudley in Boston. And he was saying, wouldn't it just be great if neighborhoods just owned their own shit? And like no one told them how to move their assets, how to move their money, how to, support their businesses. They just did it on their own. It was their own circular economy, rooted in solidarity, and really, really focus on like regenerative and restorative practice. He didn't say it with all of those really great words because that's not his language, but that was the ethos of what he was saying. And so the founders of the KCT picked that up and they said, we can build this. We can build a structure where the neighborhood collectively owns its real estate, controls its capital inflows, and determines how those dollars are reinvested for the collective benefit. So we were inspired by a guy who wrote an article because he was mad, because that's what it was. He penned an article in frustration. He was just mad about people not being able to control their own destiny and have self-determination in their own neighborhoods. And then we said, okay, like we can build this. Let's go figure out the legal infrastructure. Let's figure out the financial modeling. Let's figure out the governance structure. Right. So there was a lot of parts to define, but like the concept of this collective ownership came from Joe Margulies. Can we speak about how we don't have subsidies? So we do have subsidies. I'm sorry, I want to make sure I'm very clear. We do have subsidies. They're just not from the government. So we are taking in grant dollars from foundations, and we can also take in charitable donations, right? So like a wealth holder is more than welcome to write us a check. We just don't take in government subsidy at this time, but we were just invited, and there's a small chance that it'll actually be awarded. So we may have our first government dollars in the mix in short order. And somebody wants to have a one-to-one with me, and I am more than happy to do that. I will drop my email in the chat. I just ask that you drop me a line that says, hey, I was on this thing and I want to have a chat, and then I will send you some of my availability. And I will not lie to you. We're looking at like late May right now, but I do get back to folks. I respond, and I will lock you into the calendar, I promise. I think I answered all the questions in the chat.
Wait.
We have one more question in person.
Kidding.
Or more questions in person.
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify, that's Professor Joel, Joel, or Joe, Joe Margulies.
Yeah, Joe, and his last name is Margulies. And if you go to our website, here, let me just find it really fast. In our resource center, we link to that original article that he wrote when he was mad, which is what inspired the trust to form the neighborhood trust model. I will find it and I will put it in the chat in 10 seconds.
You are finding.
As you are finding that, I know you had mentioned that half of your team lives in, oh, they want me on
You
camera.
can see you.
Yes. Hi. They said you said that half of your team lives in Kensington.
Mhm.
I'm wondering if you can talk about how it was like the choice that, or how it was come to that decision of like making sure staff members lived in the neighborhood or in the neighborhood that y'all are working in, and how that has impacted organizationally your culture. I was just curious to that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Let's see. I will say a lot of it is built into like our values and the way that we move, focusing and prioritizing on solidarity and circular and restorative economics. Just as we believe deeply that the folks who are making the decisions around how the trust moves and operates should come from the neighborhood, we also believe deeply that as many of the folks as possible, and ideally in some future moment, our entire team, should be having the financial benefit of the staffing structure, right? Of the dollars that are flowing in and creating and producing for this neighborhood. Also, just as like a matter of fact, at least in terms of our practice, when you are so deeply tied and connected to something in the way that like a resident is to this work, you are 10 times more passionate about making sure that you find the solutions and that you take that next step and that you make that last call and that you like give it your all because it directly impacts you, right? Like you are just as committed to making sure that the model is successful as well as making sure that every resident is heard, as well as making sure that every small business owner feels supported. It's just been just a really beautiful and organic way for us to grow. And we are hoping to move closer and closer to 100% employees in the neighborhood across time.
Thank you so much. Well, this brings us to time, Adriana. Thank you. Let's give a round of applause again for some love in the chat. So for folks who are online or for folks who are in person, this is going to be the kind of content that we'll be sharing all month. So we really thank Adriana for sharing so much that's going on with KCT. And we also, I saw in the chat that there were some folks that are asking, will this recording be shared out to folks? We do have a YouTube channel that I dropped in the chat, and I'll drop one more time in the chat. So that is updated very regularly. And maybe we have actually one more quick question. No?
I do.
Oh yeah, we have one more quick question.
Yeah.
Hi, Adriana. Tamachi. Adriana.
Hi,
My apologies.
Tamachi.
Hi. I just have a quick question. I'm really excited to hear about how you all work actively with the artists in your community as a part of your methodology, in your recording of your own data, and also in the telling of your own story in communities in the built environment. How else does art education show up in the neighborhood or in the community? Are there buildings or spaces that are reserved for community arts education and for like artists to actually make? Are there studio spaces for work to happen outside of the mural projects?
Yes, that's a great question. Yes, thanks so much. That's a great question. So a couple of things. One, we definitely do prioritize local artists in all of our work as much as possible. That's not to say that we don't work with artists who live in like broader Philly, but when possible, if we can identify a Kensington-based one, we definitely want to do that. Again, keeping the dollars local, feeding that local economy. So we do murals. We also do art installations. And I just dropped a link to our most recent one that was installed last summer. It's a giant jar, like ceramic jar. And it was developed by an artist that's also from the neighborhood who's received like worldwide recognition at this point, but he like grew up in Kensington, Puerto Rican dude. And he designed the vessel and then across the span of a year worked with residents to think about different like fabrics or textures to add to the fuller image. We do have one artist gallery currently on the corridor inside of one of the KCT stewarded spaces that also where do I want to say the word, like also operates as a studio for teaching. So they're offering classes. They also offer collaborative spaces for other, primarily muralists. I would say artists at large, but primarily muralists. And so that's the only physical space that we have currently around the arts. Around creative economy, we have several other tenants, but we're specifically thinking about like a visual art or a physical art. We have that gallery. In the future, we anticipate that we will be making dedicated maker spaces. There are currently some that exist actually in Kensington. They're just owned by private developers. And so another thing that we're actively thinking about is what it would look like to take those spaces and bring them into the trust. So essentially exiting the private developers. So lots of potential strategies there.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks.
I dropped lots of links in the chat, friends. So like keep all the links.